Amanda, I want to invite you to maybe introduce yourself and Heather, and then kind of kick us off.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, Stu. And thanks everyone for joining. So I'm Amanda. I head up marketing at Growth Machine, which is an SEO and content creation agency. My sort of quick career is started out as a journalist, had a quarter life crisis, decided to become a chef, didn't become a chef, but went to culinary school, then got into marketing that way. And so I kind of got into content marketing pretty early on when it wasn't really a thing. And at the time I was like, oh, I know how to write. I can probably do this. So that was kind of my entryway there. I joined the Growth Machine team last summer, and there, that's where I met Heather. Heather is our guest today, and Heather runs the show for content with respect to our many clients, and she was actually the second employee that Nat Eliason, our founder, had hired. And she has really scaled the team from just her to a team of in-house editors. I think there are 4 editors now. And then a writer database of over 6,000 writers. So she's managing all this stuff, managing our dozens plus clients, and publishing upwards of 300 posts per month. Across all of our
Not
clients.
by myself, but
completely alone.
Yes, it's all me.
So yeah, we'll get into it here, and then we'll also flag if you have questions along the way, pop them in the chat, and then I'll try to do my best to just kind of incorporate them throughout my questions. And then I'll leave some time at the end for Q&A as feels natural. And yeah, and if anyone feels very compelled by something that Heather's saying, feel free to unmute and be like, I must speak. Please, I want to hear from you too. Cool. So Heather, let's give a quick intro on you. I was doing a lot of talking just now. Let's talk a little bit more about you and how you joined Growth Machine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I found my current position on Twitter, which is a perfect place for job searching. I was getting to that point where you're like, I've looked at every job posting I feel like exists out there and nothing is coming through. I was working as a youth pastor, super random, but I knew I loved writing, and it was kind of like your chef journey sounds like. I was like, let me see if this is a thing, and then realized like, okay, this is not a thing. And I want to go back to writing, and I always knew that was what I loved. And so was at the end of my rope with job searching, and just Google or searched on Twitter, like editing job. And our founder was tweeting like, this is the best editing job on the internet, apply here. And I thought it was like a fake job because yeah, like Amanda said, I was the 3rd employee, and I was like, I don't think this is real, but I'll just try. I was not familiar with startup culture or the startup world at all, so I had no idea what I was doing. But I knew I loved editing and writing, and so it was like, let me just jump in. And it's been so fun because our team started with just a handful of clients, and publishing about 80, 90 posts a month across all of our clients, and now we're up to that 250 to 300-ish number, big team of editors, and a lot of freelance writers that we work with day to day to produce all that content. So I love it. It's so much fun to work with writers every day when you love writing yourself, and the editing side of it is super fun. So I'm really excited to chat today.
Awesome. And I spoke to it kind of quickly just by saying, now we have, first it was you, now we have editors, and we have a writer database. Could you fill in more of the details there and tell us more about what was the editorial team or the process like when you joined, and how have you kind of scaled it to how it is today?
Yeah, so when I joined, there was a lot of systems in place for how we did things SEO wise, but not a lot for how we did things writing wise. And there was no style guides, there was no set style book to use, which I was like, oh my gosh, first step, we're using AP style. Any trained journalist is like, that's our home base. So I set that up for us and started implementing a style guide kind of procedure for each client. So we started itemizing and notating the writing style that each client wanted, and having these internal documents that we could hand to our writers so that we could hand it to them and say, this is what your expectations are. This is the voice you're going to want to be using. these are links they love, these are sources they hate, like this is, so handing that to the writers and really empowering them and giving them expectations off the bat, rather than like having them turn in a piece and being like, this is actually all wrong, but you didn't know that, so now start over. Like that's the danger that I could see happening if we didn't have these standardized style guides. And so kind of implemented that, and really just implemented a standardized editing process from what I had learned in journalism school, and from working in editing, what I learned really worked for me as a writer, and kind of started implementing like, okay, here's how we do revisions, here's how we do outlines, things like, excuse me, things like that. So really just started applying everything I had learned from being a writer myself and being an editor back in my college days, and started applying it to our team. So I feel like now things are a lot more streamlined and standardized, and writers know exactly what they're going to be getting into when they start working with us. And it's been a lot better. It started out in a great place, and I feel like now we're in an even better spot.
Cool. I have a bunch of questions here, in kind of different buckets of like feedback, brand voice and style, and writing for the internet. So let's talk about some feedback first, especially because here at Compound, we support each other by providing only truly helpful and constructive feedback. So I do want to spend some time on this. So as an editor, what have you seen be the most effective ways to provide feedback to our writers?
Yeah, one of the most important things that I like to do with new writers is to have them write outlines beforehand. As writers, we're typically already outlining our work before we start, and it can often be skipped once we get comfortable, but I love to start with outlines for their first handful of articles. That way, you're not wasting your time writing an entire article, and then I'm like, wait, actually, the structure is not what the client would like, or this tone of voice seems kind of off, or the points you're making seem a little bit off. So outlines are awesome, because then the writer can have the comfort of like, okay, I'm headed in the right direction. As long as I fill out this outline well, then I'll be good to go. And then I can have the peace of mind of like, okay, this is the right writer for this article. They're going to write something that is hopefully going to need minimal edits as far as overall content and structure. So I love to start there to really align on our expectations, even though it is a little bit of extra work on the front end. I feel like it really saves time on the back end. And then once the content is written, as far as feedback, we work in Google Docs, and I live in suggested changes. That's my favorite way to edit like minor copy edits. So I don't like to tell writers I don't like to make them do all the copy edits. We kind of take care of that for them, but I do like them to see it, so that if there's consistent mistakes, they can see like, okay, she's always adding an Oxford comma or whatever. Well, in my dreams, they would recognize that pattern, but a lot of times they don't. And I have to say,
do you like the Oxford comma, or do you dislike it?
We've been on quite the journey together, me and the Oxford comma. It's been like a really up and down relationship. So starting out being trained in AP style, I didn't use it, and I learned to like just automatically like always take it away. And now I'm obsessed with it, and I use it, and that was my own choice. And so I feel like I'm kind of betraying AP style, but it's just my preference now, and I get to have that preference.
Yeah. We've had a very similar journey, you and I, with the Oxford comma.
Yeah, there's some things that I'm like, I respect the AP style book, and then there's some things that I'm like, this actually doesn't sit well with me in my heart, and the Oxford comma is one of those.
Yeah, sometimes with things like numbers in AP style, like it wants you to write it out, and in some instances it makes more sense, but sometimes it's easier to just see the numbers and the percentage sign right in front of you.
Exactly. They used to have you spell out percent, and that was a dark time. I don't know if anyone here remembers that. They changed it to using the symbol, and like, gosh, what a good day that was. I was like, thank God. It was just so annoying. It makes no sense. So yeah. So those minor copy edits. Yeah. Welcome to the new world, Amanda.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I like to just not really waste time by like explaining all those logistics. So I use suggested changes for that, so they can just see it. And then I leave comments for something where like, if I was going to change it, it would kind of affect the voice. And like, I wouldn't want to rewrite it in my words because that's my words. And so I really like to respect and preserve their voice as much as possible. So with feedback, I'll leave comments saying like, okay, I see what you're trying to say here, but this sentence gets a little long. And so it gets a little confusing. And I think the reader might be a little lost by the end. So, you know, can you either break this up or can you shorten the sentence by about half? So I leave kind of like more substantial comments like that when I'm like, I could take the time to do this, but I would rather you get to improve your writing and you get to do those types of changes are more productive and helpful, I feel like, as far as feedback goes. And then I really like to comment on what I like and show them like what to repeat. So like, I like to say like, this intro is perfect. You know, the reader's going to be hooked by this and they're going to keep reading. This is awesome. So as an editor, really try to stay balanced of like, here's what worked and what I loved, and here's where we can improve.
So this is interesting because you mentioned not wanting to impart your personal preference too much, such that you don't want to take away from their voice.
Yeah.
But when you are managing these articles for our clients, you're actually thinking about three different things. You're thinking about the writer's style, your style, and then the client style. So how do you think about how do you kind of break that out? Like, how do you know what's feedback based on your preference and feedback on what the client wants and not wanting to take away from the writer's voice?
As much as I can, I put my voice at the bottom. So like, I may think I know the best way to say something, but like, I'm not hired to write the piece. So I try to really prioritize the writer's voice over my own, unless, you know, as writers, we do have weaknesses in certain areas. And so if I see something that's like, okay, this isn't just my preference, but like objectively, this doesn't work. I'll stick to that type of feedback of like, I might write this differently, but objectively, here's what needs to happen for this part to be better. And then the client's voice is really at the top of that priority list. So if an example is something that the writer thinks is like funny and pithy, but I'm reading it and I'm like, I know this client and I know that they will think this is cheesy, then I will comment and be like, this example is super fun, but I think the client might prefer something like this. Like, here's an example. Can you try something along those lines? And that way they still get to make the choice and pick a new example, but we're still respecting what the client needs from us. And so they really are our top priority. And the lesson in writing about like not being too precious with your work really comes into play when you're writing for another person and in another person's voice, because you cannot be precious at all with any of your writing, because it's not technically your writing at the end of the day. It gets handed over and put often under someone else's name, which can be painful, but really that they become our priority, and we try to sound exactly like they would sound if they wrote it themselves.
Before we get more into this, the brand voice and style stuff, a last question I have here on feedback is, how do you establish trust between the feedback giver and the recipient?
Okay, I've done this very wrong in the past. I feel like I know my personality and know that I'm like a generally nice person. And if I leave feedback that's direct, it's not because I hate them, but I've made the mistake of assuming that too strongly and assuming like, oh, they'll get it. Like, they'll know that I don't mean any harm by my comments. And I one time had a writer reach out to me and say, like, she was brand new and she was like, hey, I don't know if you like hated my piece. I don't know if you hate me, but I just wanted to say I'm so sorry. And she like came to me like so tentative, and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I did not hate your piece. I was editing it at like 6 p.m. I was ready to be done with work, and I was just being super short and direct. And we had a great conversation, and I was like, I am so sorry. Like, your piece was awesome. I just saw a lot of spots I needed to improve so I could get it to the client quicker. And that was a great lesson. And we have a good relationship now, but it was definitely this rocky start of me being like too task oriented and just being like, fix this, fix this, fix this. And she doesn't know me. So she was like, who is this jerk? My new editor sucks. And so I really learned to treat writers like humans and not get too focused on the task of editing and correctness and accuracy, but really pair that with like, this is a human being on the other side who's like just submitted their piece being like, I hope they like it. And reading my comments being like, are you kidding me? So I really try to pair that's why I try to stay positive with my feedback and be kind if I have a critique. And I really try to write in Google Docs and in my comments like I would if I was saying it to a real person face to face. And so a lot of the times I I'm not ashamed to use like smiley faces, exclamation points, like whatever it takes so that a writer knows like, I'm not mad at you, but like, hey, let's get on the same page. And then once I get to know them more, I can be more direct and more snappy, and they know like Heather's not a jerk. She just needs to get her job done. So I kind of start really, really soft in my edits as much as I can. But at the same time, like I said, I am pretty direct. And that's why I made that mistake with that writer, because as a writer, I kind of want to know if something doesn't work. I don't need to be like coddled. So I don't want it to sound like I coddle the writers, but like, yeah, definitely just try to be a human with them and not just get too caught up in my timeline and my deadlines and stuff like that.
Totally. And to the point though about coddling or not being coddled is like I'm pretty similar to you, and especially if I'm writing for my job, like writing for a client or writing for someone else, I am much less emotional about it. So I don't care if I personally don't care if someone sends me back a Google Doc like riddled with comments of like, don't like this, cut this, change this. I'm like, cool, now I know.
Right.
But it's also very different when someone is writing more personally. And I'm thinking about this a lot because I'm doing I'm doing Rite of Passage, David Perel's course. And so we're giving each other a lot of feedback and receiving a lot of feedback. And so I'm thinking about like when I am providing comments on people's Google Docs, I'm starting to think more about, okay, how can I help this person be a better writer as a whole?
Right.
Instead of picking nits with like, oh, like I think you should use an M dash here, not an N dash, or like use a double N dash, like it should be an M dash.
Yeah,
I'll add
which
an
matters.
Yeah, it matters.
It's like, yeah,
but
those
like,
things matter, and that's why I do those types of edits just as suggested changes, so they can just accept it, move on. We don't have to talk about it. But as far as like our conversation on the document, I want that to be, I want my goal is always as a teacher type of editor of like, how can I teach you what I see in this? And I also learn from them a lot too. I mean, I don't come into a piece being like, I know the best way to do this, but I do know what the client needs. I do have an eye for, the piece that they have been spending 2 hours in this document, and I have fresh eyes. And so I'm not afraid to be direct and help them improve, because as a writer, I'm the same way. I'm not super sensitive as a person. So I don't get offended if someone's like, cut this. And especially since I'm an editor, I understand like, okay, sometimes we have a vision as writers and it doesn't pan out. And that doesn't mean we're a bad writer. It just means we need each other to help improve our pieces. And we need someone else's eyes to be like, see what you were trying to do here. Let's try something else. And it's a very delicate process, but obviously you guys probably know as writers who have been edited, like we all understand it's kind of just how it goes. But sometimes I can lean too heavily on that and be like, they get it. I'll just be direct. And then they come like crying to me and I'm like, I'm sorry.
We have a couple questions in the chat that I'm going to address. I want to flag Lyle's question, which is about feedback and about verbal versus written versus in editing. Verbal versus written editing feedback. Because, he's been in some writing groups where verbal feedback was especially helpful, especially if you have more nuanced feedback. So how does that come into play at all with our writers and our clients?
Man, to be honest, it doesn't. We don't really have much of a channel for verbal feedback. I often wish I did have the time to chat with every writer individually, because I feel like it's so much easier, especially if I have like a tougher edit where I've left a ton of comments. I feel like it's so much easier to jump on the phone and be like, hey, don't be scared by all these comments. Like there is some formatting stuff we need to align on, but like overall, here's what I see in this piece. And I loved this part. And like, then they can hear my voice and be like, okay, like, let me jump into these edits and we'll get through this. And so I really wish I could use that channel, because then they can hear my voice and I can hear theirs and we can get on the same page. But the reality of our timeline and working with like 50 freelancers at a time is like, I just have to go on Slack comments and Asana comments and Google Doc comments. And so I end up often typing a lot, like I would be talking to them in person and saying, like leaving this long thing of like, okay, don't be overwhelmed and you go into the doc, focus on this first, then this. And I end up just typing like I would say something in person to hopefully make it less annoying or less harsh.
I've had
I do prefer verbal feedback. I was just gonna say it would be great if I could chat with everyone every day. That would be as a people person, that's my preference.
Yeah, and especially
Yeah.
for that nuanced feedback. I mean, I was thinking
Mhm.
about last week, and this was in Rite of Passage. I was editing someone's piece or providing feedback on someone's piece, and it was a very personal account of how, to sum it up, it was, this person, his wife was diagnosed with cancer, and around the same time he launched a new business endeavor, and the piece was kind of about how he has a tendency to throw himself into his work to deal with his emotions and stuff like that. And as he was in his piece, there was a paragraph about regret, in terms of regretting that he wasn't more present for his wife. Not that he doesn't regret the business venture that he did, or how or even just the velocity which he did that. He just wishes he were more present for his wife. And so the way he was writing it, and sort of the tone that I was feeling from him, it felt like maybe he wanted to apologize to his wife. And so in my mind, I started constructing a piece of like, what if he wrote this as like an apology to his wife, but it was through the lens of his business venture and how he launched that? Like, I just kind of, my mind was spinning in that direction. And so I wanted to give that feedback, but at the same time, I was very conscious of, well, I'm not going to tell him to apologize to his wife, because I that's none of my business, and that's not what I mean. So I ended up writing a really long Google comment, because I couldn't just call him up on the phone and be like, hey man, here's what I think about your life. But I ended up writing a long comment that was prefaced with hey, I am in no way judging your situation or your actions or what you should or shouldn't have done in the past. This is not about that. But based on what you're saying and how you've structured this essay, I feel like you might want, I feel like what you're getting at is an apology to your wife. And I wonder, maybe, a consideration that you might have is, do you want to structure this piece as an apology? And it was a super long comment, but I mean, he seemed to respond really well to it. He was just like, oh, thank you for this. I see what you're getting at, but that's not the piece I want to write here. And that was fine too, but I hopefully did not offend him.
It sounds like you didn't. And sometimes we do just have to type like crazy to really get the heart of what we're saying across. But it's tough. And sometimes I've had writers request like a call with me, and that I love that, because I don't have the time to initiate that with everyone. But if a writer says like, hey, could we chat on the phone and get to know each other since we're going to be working together, I love that and do that. And those relationships work really well. So I would say, as writers, if that's something that's important to you guys, or you want to get to know your editor better, ask for some of their time, and that would be hopefully well received. I would love that. And I love to do that with writers. And I'd be curious too, if anyone wants to like say in the chat what helps them to receive feedback from their editors. Like, that would be helpful for me, because this is just my best guess, and what works for me. But I'd be curious to hear what other people like or don't like as far as receiving feedback, and whether that's verbal or written, or if they would have time to do a call, or like, don't even bother me, I'm busy. Like, I would be curious too what other people's experience is.
Yeah, well, David asked here if there are any common pitfalls that writers tend to fall into, or if there's any kinds of repeat feedback that you tend to have.
Absolutely. I feel like wherever people start grammatically is typically where they end up. I don't see typically a lot of improvement as far as people's grammar, like mechanical writing. And I really try to help them get better at that. But for some people, it's just like they just don't care about the placement of commas and the placement of em dashes and a semicolon versus a colon. And like, I'll leave repeat comments of like, hey, this semicolon makes this writing look a little formal. This client is more laid back. Can we not do that? And it'll be like every third article, I'm like seeing semicolons and being like, okay, we are still stuck in that zone. Or like, if writers use passive voice, it's often really hard to get them to active voice. And it's like these repeat comments, and I end up feeling like a broken record. And so sometimes I get to the point where I'm like, hey, to be honest, I've left this feedback a lot of times. I'm wondering if you maybe want to write this on a physical sticky note, stick it on your computer, read it every time you finish an article, make sure you've implemented it. I find that those are the hardest things to fix, are like a lot of the grammatical things or like mechanics of writing. A lot of writers are just like, I don't know what it is, but that seems to be my most repeat comment, is those mechanical things. And a lot of writers are totally great at improving like their voice and their tone if it's off the first time. Things like that feel easier somehow to improve.
Oh, that's interesting, because I feel like, anyway, I'm putting a pin in the passive versus active voice, because I think that'll be important later when we talk about writing for SEO and writing on the internet.
Yes.
So I want to shift to talking about style, brand voice, and tone. And actually, let's kick off with a question that Stu has here about how, when you think about matching a piece to a writer, where, we work with clients across various industries, whether it's fintech, wellness, food, and it's B2B and it's B2C. So a wide swath there. And we also have those thousands of writers. So how do you think about who's best suited to write what piece?
Yeah, to know that, I really have to start with knowing the client's voice and tone. So to do that, I look at their existing blog. We have a survey that they fill out to share with us a lot of those voice and tone details and like what they're looking for, some example articles that they love. So I look at that first and get a sense for like, okay, this client is a health client, but they're really focused on science and research. But they love alternative medicine, and they want it to all sound like you're just talking to a friend, and you're not explaining this in any type of industry insider knowledge language, but you're just chatting at coffee. Like that's how specific I think about it, and obviously how businesses think of their own business too. And so once I have that, then writers will submit samples for a specific project. So they'll kind of put themselves out there for a project once we put out a call for that project. So it's like, hey, we're looking for a health and wellness writer on the topic of tea and blah, blah, blah. We'll kind of explain what we're looking for. And they'll say like, okay, I want to be considered. So I'll look at their samples and say like, okay, are they explaining this like they're talking to a friend? Or does this sound like a scientific article on like a website of medical journals? I might skip those writers because it's how do I know that they could talk in like a conversational type of way? So I'll look at like, okay, do their samples reflect what this client's looking for, and kind of go from there. So that's my basic process.
Let's talk about how we do this at scale. So maybe the question that I have here really is how do we do this at scale? Like, how do you develop these style guides, and what makes for great editorial style guides?
Yeah, so to do it at scale, we put a lot of the client does a lot of the legwork in teaching us their style. So I mentioned that survey that has like 15 questions about their style and their preferences. And so they fill that out, and that's the basis for our style guide. And from that point, we are like professional stalkers of people's websites. So we will go to their website and really pick apart like, okay, what do they sound like? What is the phrasing on their call to action button? Like, what examples are they using in their blog? Are they talking about reality TV? Are they talking about like Tim Ferriss? Like, what are they talking about? What is like pop culture to them? What works for them? What sources are they quoting? And we'll kind of take any additional notes of like what they seem to be like and what they're talking about and what we gather their tone to be. And so we will take note of that. And then that also really builds as we go. So once we get started, we often are taking additional notes on those style guides and building those. They're kind of living documents. So we might add to the guide like, okay, this client hates semicolons, or this client only wants us to recommend free range eggs in their recipes, or this client really likes direct headlines and they hate like flowery headlines. So we'll take any notes that we notice as we're getting feedback from the client. And so that's all like in a Notion doc. And then that way, if a new writer comes onto the project, if a new editor comes onto the project, we can hand them the style guide and say like, this is this client, this is who they are. And then, really, once we have that, we're really set up to win with any article if we're notating those preferences, so that none of that knowledge is just inside the editor's head. It's like documented.
Mm-hmm. So as you're thinking about this stuff and taking note of this, it sounds like, well, do you develop some heuristics for how you think about certain clients' voice and tone? Like, do you start writing? I don't know. Do you start writing down like the examples that you mentioned, like if they mention examples of like using reality TV or not in their blog, like are those things that you actually write, like document in the style guide?
Absolutely. Yeah. I will sometimes even copy and paste, like this is the example they inserted when they did their edit. So like, this is what we can emulate. So I'll really press them for feedback and ask like, okay, does this sound like you? Like, what would you replace it with? So like an example would be, once for a client, we used a sentence that was something like, if I had a penny for every time I rescheduled an interview, then I could be sipping Mai Tais on a beach. And I noted that when the writer wrote it, and I was like, Mai Tais on a beach feels kind of like cliche. It feels a little bit like retiree-ish, like Mai Tais. I don't know. I just didn't know if it was their voice or their tone. And so I wanted to respect the writer's voice and their attempt. I was like, this isn't bad. So I like highlighted it and I asked the client, like, how does this example sound to you? Is this something you would say? And the client was like, okay, not exactly. And she changed it to something about like, you could upgrade your water cooler to a kombucha on tap, like something about kombucha versus Mai Tais. And I was like, okay, there it is. That's it. Like this client is more kombucha than Mai Tai. And so I wrote that down, as silly as it sounds, because it really helped me be like, this is their brain. Like to me, that means something, that she wanted an example about kombucha. Like that's a certain type of person. And so I do write down things like that, of like, okay, the client said they like this example, do things in this vein. Or that client also gave us an example one time of like buying Ali Wong tickets. Like that was an example she wanted in an article. And I feel like that was really helpful of like, okay, she watches Ali Wong. She likes Ali Wong. That was helpful to know. So yeah, I do document all those little things as much as I can. And I kind of turn them into like a bigger overarching theme of like, okay, she likes things geared towards millennials. She likes Netflix comedy stand-up specials. She likes healthy food, like things like that kind of really help a writer get into that client's head.
Yeah, I like the specificity of that. And then, I mean, and I think just as a good writer, you know when an example may or may not land well with a client, like that you kind of only develop that sort of instinct by writing and editing a lot. Yeah. So Lyle has a question here, which is, do you ever get pushback on client requests regarding voice and style? And how do you deal with that pushback?
Absolutely. Yes. All the time. So often like we're trying to work with industry experts. So for example, I work on a legal blog, and it's all about, to me, very like minutia, confusing, complicated legal stuff. And so I do my best to edit those well. And the writer really is the expert there, versus me being able to really provide helpful feedback on like, this legal case is actually different than how you're phrasing it. Like, I don't really know. So I kind of defer to the writer, and often the writer and the client will I'm kind of their liaison. So they don't talk directly to each other. They'll often push back on one another and be like, the writer did it wrong. And the writer will be like, no, the client's wrong. This case is this way. And then it'll be this back and forth. And I'm like, I don't know who's right. So that's a hard one, because that's an area where it's like another language to me. It's so difficult to understand.
Yeah.
So,
and in this example, I mean, the law, I mean, the writer is a lawyer, right? So they're not just like a person who like loves law. Like they actually have the degree and everything.
Exactly.
Is the blog Bob Loblaw's law blog? No.
Yeah, that's it actually.
That's the one.
Yeah. That's the precise client. Yeah, that one is tough, because I'm like, yeah, you're a practicing lawyer, and then the person editing the articles is a practicing lawyer. So I'm like, I don't know who's right. So in that case, I do defer to the client, because it's like, well, they're the one it's their article, they're publishing it. But then on this specific one, it's hard because the writer does have a byline on it. So he's like, well, it's under my name, so I don't want it to look wrong. So that one's a really hard balance. And so yes, that does come up a lot. And it's honestly kind of just like a delicate tightrope walk of trying to make both of them happy, to make the writer feel like, okay, I'm proud to put this in my portfolio, and to make the client feel like you're providing the service that we're paying for. So that's a hard one. And really just a case-by-case basis of just trying my best to mediate.
I want to spend like kind of the last section here talking about writing for SEO / writing for the internet.
Yes.
And I have a fun question here. Well, I think it's fun. And it's, I know you're a big Taylor Swift fan. So my first question here is, what has Taylor Swift taught you about SEO?
Okay. Amazing question. I love forcing people to listen to me talk about Taylor Swift. It's one of my greatest joys. Like, you guys are stuck here. If you leave now, it's rude. So this question, initially I was like, there's no connection. And then I thought of one. As a Taylor Swift scholar, I know that she has a songwriting formula that she follows a lot of the time. She often, like, for example, starts and ends a song with the same lyric. So it's kind of like these bookends. Some examples would be Love Story, Red. And then she uses really specific details in all of her songs. And so this is like kind of the thing she gets made fun of, that like she names people's names and she's just super specific in her songs. And you're like, wow, I know exactly what she's talking about, or like I can picture it. And so she has these formulas that you can kind of recognize in a Taylor Swift song. And she's constantly at the top of music charts because she knows music, she knows the formula, and she plays within those boundaries very well. And if she breaks them, it is on purpose. So therefore, when we are going over to the SEO side, it's really the same way. There's a pattern and there's a formula for success that we have to follow if we want to rank well. On the charts here would be Google. And if you break it, you have to break it with intention, and you have to kind of be Taylor Swift level if you want to break the rules and still try to rank on the #1 page of Google. You can't just like break every rule and assume like I'm still going to be #1 spot for this search term. So there's a lot of boundaries we have to play within. So that's where I see the connection.
I love it. I really do. So
Thank you.
let's talk about some of those boundaries though. Like,
yeah.
I mean, you know, there's a lot to know in SEO, but I think in terms of writing, if you're writing a blog post, there are general formulas that you should follow, right? So what are some of the guidelines, high level guidelines that you have for structuring an article?
Yeah, there are a lot of guidelines that we use. And I feel like my favorite tool, if anyone's ever going to be writing for SEO, or you want your stuff to rank on your own blog, Clearscope is a really, really wonderful tool. It basically does a lot for you. You insert your keyword that you're trying to rank for, and it tells you like 30 to 40 keywords that you would need to include in your article. So it really guides the outline of your article and lets you know, like, okay, I need to include these 40 words somehow and make it sound natural. And it even tells you like how frequently you should use the word, if you should use it just once, if you should use it 5 times. And it kind of highlights them as you go. And then at the end, it gives you a score from like A to F of how optimized it is for that keyword. And then it will also tell you the top 10 currently for that keyword, like what grade they have. So if you see like, okay, the top 10 have a B-, you want to be like, okay, I want to get to an A+, so that I have a chance to rank here. And it kind of also shows you like what your competition is talking about. As you see all these related keywords, that really gives you an idea for like what's everyone else talking about when they're writing about this subject. And if you want to rank, you have to kind of address those same topics too. And so it can really help shape your article and let you know like, okay, this is what people want to hear about when it comes to this topic. This is what everyone's talking about. And so in a way, you have to kind of like do what the crowd's doing, but then do it your own way so that it stands out. So it's a great tool to kind of give you some benchmarks for that.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about breaking the rules. First, what is a rule that Taylor Swift has broken in one of her songs, and why do you love it? That's the first question.
Oh gosh. Again, obsessed that I'm somehow in a position to force people to listen to me talk about this. What is a rule she's broken? I mean, there's just the classic, she started in country and then changed to pop all of a sudden, was just, and no one had really done that before. Like a couple people, but like not full on into pop. And she even has some songs that are more like rock. She has songs that are folk. So she's jumping into every genre and she pivots with incredible skill. So I think that's the main rule she broke, is like a country artist is now like one of the biggest pop stars of the generation. I think she literally won like artist of the generation recently, or of the century. Sorry, not the generation. Artist of the century. So I don't know. It speaks for itself.
What are some how have we broken any rules for our clients that, like, on purpose?
Yeah, occasionally. Yeah, occasionally we
Mhm.
will they'll give us some pushback on something and say like, well, we wouldn't really phrase it this way. And so uh often it comes down to like minuscule terms on our Clearscope report, right? It'll be like, okay, we have to use the term like free range, for example, to go back to that earlier example. But maybe a client doesn't believe in free range eggs. They think it's BS and you should just do regular eggs, and the food labeling industry is all a hoax. So like, then you'll have to kind of break the rule by saying like, well, you think you should eat free range, really? So you're still including that keyword, but then you're creatively working around it.
Huh.
So that's a way to kind of play within those boundaries of like, okay, you have to talk about this if you want to rank, but if your brand doesn't believe in that, you have to think of a creative way to still use those words and not be like promoting it. So that's
Yeah.
maybe
And
that's
there are times that we have to kind of break clients' rules to meet the SEO needs, right? I think there was
yeah.
there was a recent example I feel like came up in a meeting that was like a client didn't want us to name competitors in a blog post, which makes sense from like a PR kind of brand awareness perspective. But like for SEO, like the Google will know that it looks forced, right? Like it looks like you're deliberately trying to avoid naming something, which just comes off as unnatural and strange.
Right. Yeah. It's like if you're doing an article on like top 10, like top 10 business credit cards, and you don't list any of your competitors, if you're a business credit card, then it looks pretty dumb. You're like, this isn't a top 10. This is like just a PR article for your article to make you end up at number one. So that can be a tough one when they're like, well, we don't want to talk about anyone else or give them any credit. It's like, well, if you want to do this listicle, then we have to figure out a way to make this work.
Mm-hmm. If we do that kind of thing, do we link to the competitors?
Yeah, so that's a hard one. We probably would steer them away from that topic in the first place if they don't want to give any traffic to other to their competition. But a good workaround is to not link to them. They're still getting the mention though in SEO wise, but yeah, you could skip the link, and I just wouldn't write the article honestly for that type of client, but that's a whole nother story.
Yeah. Cool. Are there any what are some, if I mean, it's kind of hard to say because not everything is the same, but
Yeah.
what are some of the best kind of, what are some keyword and sort of link best practices for SEO?
Yeah. So I feel like that, yeah, this can apply even to your own personal work on your own blog if you're wanting to get some more traffic to it. Some things that we do for our clients every single time are we include at least 3 internal links back to other spots on your blog. So you want to find ways that you can work in your other posts, and it's best to link to it kind of naturally, not like check out my other post on this. But if you mention like a key term from your other post, just kind of drop a link in there subtly to your other post, like you see on any article. So that works really well for SEO to kind of link back to yourself, and then also include at least one external link, and preferably one that's high authority. So not like Wikipedia, not some other person's random blog that is like your cousin, but like a high authority source.
Like a news article or like maybe even a journal?
Absolutely. Journal article would be great. News article. Or yeah, something from like, if you're a health writer, something from like Harvard Health or the NCBI, or like whatever the kind of industry standard is for what topic you're talking about. Or if you're like a business writer, then linking to another like business expert in the space, like something that's pretty popular or well-researched is going to be a good link. And so that's like the bare minimum. You can do more external links, you can do more internal, but that's our bare minimum. And then when other people are seeing that you're linking to them, over time your domain authority will grow and grow if other people are linking back to you and to your post. So having a very rich like system of linking is really really important. And I think something that's easy to bypass.
Mhm.
I think that's it's a really important one.
I think the internal linking thing too is important. I think for any site or any personal site, even, where it helps you think about your overall content strategy. Like if you are, if you are writing on your personal site and publishing frequently, and if you feel like you can't link to anything that you've already written about, there's a little bit of like, then what are you doing? A little bit of like, if all of your topics are just so disparate that it's hard for you to kind of naturally link to your own stuff, then because there's the broader question of, well, what are you even writing about? What do you want to be known for?
Right. Yeah. And we find over and over again that these super niche blogs do the best versus someone who's like writing about everything they can possibly think of, or anything they're interested in, or anything they're fascinated by. I'm sure you guys talk about that a lot in this group, but like really honing in on a niche is huge. If you can kind of have this corner on the market of, like, for me, like, let's say people talking about Taylor Swift's songwriting prowess and how it relates to SEO, whatever, like that's super niche. And not a lot of people are going to be writing about that, unfortunately. So really honing in on your niche can really help, because if you don't have enough to interlink to, then that could be a great sign of like, okay, what can I focus on for the next few months? Yeah.
A question I wanted to get back to here was on the passive versus active voice, because this relates to SEO. What is the significance of this? Like, why do you have like what is the problem with passive voice, and how do you seek to resolve that with writers?
Well, I think really for me, the problem with it is just for good writing. I don't necessarily think of it directly tied to SEO initially, but if the whole thing is written in passive voice, the reader might get lost and bored and feel like this isn't really written very well, and I don't know why. And they might leave the page before, after the first paragraph. And if people aren't really finishing your articles, then that's not good for SEO. So passive voice is just always, in my mind, a weaker sentence than if you made it active, if you made it actionable, applicable. Just those types of, an active sentence has like more energy to me, like more bounce. It's just like a more energetic sentence. And so I always try to direct people to look at that. And it's so easy to write passive sentences too. Like sometimes I even look at my own work and I'm like, oh gosh, like once you're looking for it, you're like, oh, I naturally like accidentally included all these passive sentences. So something like Hemingway is a great tool for that. Hemingway is super picky and will really help highlight any weak sentences or any passive sentences. And so that's a good one if that's an issue for you.
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah. And I think for SEO, it's also just because passive can be harder to read, that as Google tries to scan your articles, it'll be like, I don't know what to do with this.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, another SEO thing that I just thought of that would be helpful for you guys is, as you're writing your headers to split up your content, something that Google really likes is if you ask a question in a header to answer it like immediately under, versus, so let's say the header is like, what is Sauvignon Blanc? Instead of like waxing poetic about like, Sauvignon Blanc, what a great wine. I drank it on this day when I broke up with my boyfriend. Like Google really likes if you're just like, what is Sauvignon Blanc? And immediately you're like, Sauvignon Blanc is a white wine that is found in this region. Google really likes that because that's where they pull those featured snippets. Like when you Google and there's like the first result there, that comes from blogs that are like asking questions and answering them right away. And so it's helpful for SEO and for ranking on Google to have that type of very clear writing. And then you can get into your more like creative writing in other parts of the article, or like after you define a term you're talking about. So that can be something to think about too, is like under your headers, if you're asking a question, are you directly answering that right under? Because that can help you to rank quicker. So that's another tip we use.
Yeah, that's a good tip. I wouldn't have thought of that. Cool. Maybe we can kind of wrap up in this question if it's relevant. if for anybody who might be thinking about outsourcing their writing efforts, whether it's on their own behalf or for a company, what's the advice you would have for them?
I would say, yeah, if you're going to outsource, then you typically don't have enough time to do it yourself. Like you wish you could, but you don't have enough time. And so you need to pass that off. You need to free up your schedule. And so you really need to pick a writer or a company that you trust so you can actually hand over the reins. It's really hard, especially as if you're a writer yourself, to hand over the reins of writing to someone else. So you've got to pick someone who's like, you're a big fan of their work, you're a big fan of what they do. That way you can actually get the time back that you need by letting them do their thing versus like not really trusting them and needing to give a ton of feedback and needing to redirect left and right. So yeah, I'd say pick someone or a company that you look up to and you're excited about, and then truly hand over the reins instead of like handing over one rein and then like holding onto the other one for dear life. I think there's two reins in a horse situation. I did not grow up in the country. Yeah.
We don't have a horse client, so we don't know.
No horse clients yet. I will learn if we do.
Cool. Maybe we can open it up for questions if anyone wants to chime in.
Great. And I encourage anyone, you're welcome to unmute, like Amanda said, and ask a question, but I'm happy to kick us off with a related one to Amanda, what you just said, which is where the heck do you find great writers? Where do you kind of recruit and find talent and people you trust? Super curious to hear more about finding writers.
Yes. So we have a database that we have gathered, like Amanda said, it's like upwards of 6,000-7,000 writers. And it really is just a submission form. It's not like a formal application process to get into that database. People just fill out a form. Like any of you could fill it out today. I would encourage you to do so. It's on our website. And so writers that are interested in doing freelance work in the content creation space, in the SEO space, just basically are expressing their interest. And then from there, for each project, we send out we kind of narrow down that database because they include what topics they're interested in and what their rate is. So we narrow it down to like the specs of our project, which might get the database down to like 400. And then I send out a specific call of like, okay, this is the timeline of our project. This is what's expected. This is how long the articles are. If you're interested, submit here. Then they submit again, and I go through that by hand and I read each entry, I look at their sample work, I look at their portfolio, and I gather it down to like a smaller pool of maybe 5 writers to send to the client to give them the option to choose. And we go from there. And sometimes those writers often work out perfectly and they're awesome and they're wonderful. Occasionally there's a writer who just had a really good editor and actually isn't that good of a writer, and we have to cut ties with them. But often those writers work out super well. And if I can't find anyone in there, I go to Upwork, I go to LinkedIn, I just do a simple Google search if it's a really niche topic, and I kind of will just message people and ask if they're interested in applying. So that's something I do too if we have a topic I can't seem to find a writer for.
Mm-hmm. And we have our people can apply on the writerfinder.com, I think. Or is that what the application is?
Just our website. Yeah, growthmachine.com would be a good first step. And it's called content creator. The position is called content creator. Mm-hmm. So it might be on Writer Finder too. You might be right, Amanda.
Yeah. Well, our Writer Finder database, that's the one. That's a service that we have where if you're looking for a writer to hire, you can enter your info there and fill out a quick survey, and then we get back to you within a day or two.
Yeah.
Yeah. What are some of the topics that you have? This is from Josh. What are some of the topics that you have trouble finding writers for? The topics you have zero, and what are the topics that you have zero trouble finding writers for?
Okay, I'll start with zero trouble. Business, lifestyle, like e-commerce, health and wellness. My goodness, never short of health and wellness writers, or fitness or diet writers, like so many options. Tougher ones to staff are finance. A lot of people are a little bit overconfident in their finance writing skills, and then like I read their pieces and I'm like, this is bad advice. um, or just like poorly written. So finance has been a trickier one for me to staff. So if any of you are finance writers, please save me and enter our writer database. That one, yeah, it just seems to be tricky because it's such a particular field where you really have to have like good knowledge. You can't just have like Googled like tips. You know, you really got to know your stuff in that field. And like our clients will know if the writer doesn't know their stuff. It'll be really easy to spot. So that one's a bit harder. Anything tech is a bit harder too. There's a lot of tech writers out there, so I typically will get a lot of submissions, but often it's a lot of them aren't great submissions, and so I'm down to like a really small list once I eliminate a lot of people. So that's a hard one, but it's a very common client we have. We have a lot of tech clients, and so it's one I'm often in need of. Yeah, whether it's fintech or like software development or AI, things like that. Those are all a bit tougher.
Mm-hmm. I'll answer this too, because I get some cold outreach too for writing.
Mm-hmm.
I've found that it's hard to find a really good B2B writer because there's a lot of nuance in there that when you're writing for the B2B space, the business to business space, that a lot of the knowledge and examples you draw from ideally come from working in-house, like at a B2B company. And you can always tell when a writer hasn't worked in-house. When you can just tell like, oh, they're a freelance writer, like based on like the examples they use, maybe even based on like the introductory or teaser text that they have. Or you know, like, oh, you've never worked on a marketing team, I can tell.
Yeah, that's a good one. That is hard. Yeah, anything where people or the client requires like a specific set of experience can be a little bit hard, or like a specific set of credentials, especially if it's a higher tier one. Like for right now, this week, I'm trying to staff a project for people. The writer needs to have like opened and owned a restaurant. That's really hard because not a lot of people who are working in the restaurant space are now like pursuing their dream of being a writer. So that one is tough. Wish me luck. Yeah. But when there's that specific expertise required of like, I need someone who's done this before, who's owned a business, who's a working psychologist. That's another one we're trying to staff. Super hard. And if there are people that are writers in that space, they're above the client's price range. And so that's a really hard one, is like when you want someone who has this experience, but you're not able to pay for that experience. Or it's just a field where like people are working in this field, they're not necessarily writing about it as much. Those are hard ones.
Yeah.
So I would say too, like to spin that into advice, if you have like a work history or a job history that you think sets you apart, or like maybe not a lot of people are writing about that, I might think about writing some sample pieces in that space. And really, if you want to get into content writing, we're always looking for subject matter experts on like any topic under the sun. Like you'd be surprised what specific topics come up. Like all the ones I just listed are real examples, and all the examples I've used throughout this are all real examples. So there's really specific things out there that people are like, I need a writer who has experience working with payment processing systems. And it's like, okay, there's people out there who are like, that's me, you know, and I would never think. So I've learned like there's kind of a writer for every topic, even if it's really hard to find. There's someone out there who has experience using payment processors in their small business and writing about it. So that's a great way to market yourself if you want to get into content writing, of like, okay, I have this work experience that I never thought I would apply, but I can write about it and I know what I'm talking about. Like that's a really valuable thing.
All right. Well, I think we're at the top of the hour now. Heather, thanks for being game for this. This was a lot of fun.
Of course.
And thank you everyone
for
joining. Thank you, Lyle, David, Joshua. Thank you. Thanks, Stu.
That was so much fun. Heather and Amanda, thank you both. And we'll have this recording ready shortly. So probably first thing next week, we'll have the actual edited version of this conversation. Not that we need to edit a thing out because it was so insight dense, but we'll edit out any coughs or unmutes and stuff like that. But thank you both for joining for this event. So excited to do more of these. And Heather, you were just an amazing guest. Amanda, thank you for the incredible preparation and questions. and we can't wait for the next one.
Yeah, excited.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for
Awesome.
coming.
Thanks so much, everybody. We'll see ya.
Bye.
Bye.